I'm Jenna Miscavige. I was born and raised in Scientology. I left when I was 21 years old and wrote a book about it. My uncle, David Miscavige, is the leader of Scientology. And this is my YouTube channel. Hey guys, I hope you had a wonderful weekend and a wonderful start to your week. And I am back today with a question. I am taking a little break from the Shelley question today so I can answer Stacy, the SPTV addicts question, which is, if you could make a bullet point list, especially for us Neverends, to share with other Neverends on social media about the 10-15 worst things about the Church of Scientology, to maybe draw someone in to look into it more, question it more, and even be compelled to also share, what would those bullet points be? I thought this was a great question and a great tool for people to have. So I made a list, and I think I will take one thing on the list at a time. And of course, the first thing on this list is child abuse. So in Scientology, if you aren't already aware, members of their core group called the Sea Organization, they sign billion-year contracts. And the children of those people who are part of that core organization, they are also sometimes required to sign these contracts from a young age. I myself was one of those children, and I signed a 1 billion year contract dedicating my soul to servitude for 1 billion years so I could be a SEERG member and serve the Church of Scientology. Another reason why I think that this is the worst thing about Scientology is because in cases such as the Sea Organization, in many cases, even when people aren't in the Sea Organization, they're just a regular public paying Scientologist, like some celebrities are, or just a regular Scientologist. You don't even have to be in the most dedicated group for this one to happen, which is not living in a home with your families and being separated from your families for years. So as a paying Scientologist, sometimes they send their kid to live with another person for months while they're getting Scientology services or something like that. But in my case, my parents joined the Sea Organization a little bit before I was 2. And from that point on, I never once in my entire childhood lived in a home with my parents. I would visit them for a couple hours on the weekends, and that's it. And by a couple hours, I mean they would get home at about midnight on Saturday evening, and then I would have to leave again by 11 a.m. the next morning. So most of the time was spent sleeping, and I literally always lived in a dormitory and with other kids at a boarding school. And I just think not having a place where you call home and not having a parent who you can speak to about your experiences every day, and not have somebody in your corner who's safeguarding you, who's making sure you're being treated well, who's making sure you're learning what you should be learning, who is loving you every day, I think that's amazingly and disgustingly destructive. Another reason why I think this is the worst thing about Scientology is that children are exploited for labor in Scientology. That was the case with me. From when I was 6 years old until I was 12 years old, I worked 35 hours of manual labor a week. This was anything from cleaning, making food for adult Scientologists, working in the galley, digging trenches, weeding the property that we were on, planting trees, hauling rocks, building rock walls, carrying sandbags, carrying railroad ties. It was all ground maintenance type work. And that was until I was 12. After that, I was required to operate programs in Scientology's organizations, do designs for their buildings, and all of this was happening. So from when I was 12 until I was 16, or actually until I was 21. At that point, it was no longer just 35 hours a week. I mean, it was like 60 hours a week. We woke up we had to be at the base at 9 a.m. and we didn't go home until midnight. So that's essentially my entire childhood. dedicated to working more hours than a normal adult would. And that's just as a kid, and that's my experience, and that was my experience. That was the experience of the many other children who I lived with at all times when I was in Scientology as a Sea Org member. This kind of leads to the next point of why I think child abuse is the worst aspect of Scientology, which is a deprivation of education. So when you're doing all that work, that leaves less time for schooling. And the schooling that I had from when I was 6 until I was 12, there was no grade levels. All kids of all ages were in the same classroom. There was no teacher who was teaching us what we were supposed to learn. We had to use self-led checklists, and basically if you asked the teacher for help, they were required by the policies of Scientology to not explain anything to you. They would have to ask you to find what word you didn't understand. And this was very difficult as a 6-year-old, as a 10-year-old, as a 9-year-old. It was like I needed help and I did not get it. And they also basically very much neglected things like social studies, learning about government, learning about geography, learning about many important things in the world, because they believed that literacy was the only thing that was important, because I was being groomed to become a Sea Org member who worked full-time for Scientology as part of their clergy, so to speak. So I didn't, as far as they were concerned, I didn't need to know about government. In fact, it would probably be more of a risk to them, if anything. The more I knew about the world, the more I might want to leave. So I lived in a very isolated environment where I did not see people who were non-Scientologists. I didn't even see people who weren't Sea Org members. And I did not get an education about the world outside and what it was like and what my rights were and things I would need to know when I later left. From when I was 12 until I was 16, I only went to school 1 day a week. That was the case for all minors in Clearwater, Florida. They only went to school 1 day a week. I do not have a GED. I do not have a high school diploma. And also after I was 16, I was not allowed to go to school even for the 1 day a week when the other minors were allowed to. I was forbidden to actually go to school. And so not having an education just leaves you where you don't necessarily know how the world around you works. So if you leave Scientology, you're just so much less equipped to handle life and to get a job and to get on your feet. All right, the next reason why I think that child abuse is the worst aspect of Scientology and the most dangerous aspect is because what I have here is having children be interrogated about sexual matters and having children interrogate grown adults while in locked rooms and they're unable to leave. So while I was a Scientologist and a Sea Org member, from when I was born until I was 21 years old, I was repeatedly and consistently interrogated by grown adults about like sexual things. And you're actually required to fill out a life history form where you detail literally every time you've touched yourself, every time you've kissed anybody, any sexual interaction you've had whatsoever. And part of my job for probably about a year when I was about 14, when I worked in the Sea Organization in Clearwater, was I worked in the ethics department where I did filing, and I was responsible for making sure other staff fell in line. And one time I was required to interview an adult where I basically had to hear about this 6-year-old woman's sexual fantasies, basically. And this is just part of training as an auditor. You expect to hear those things if you are training to become a Scientology auditor, which is a counselor. And you're even trained to ask private questions that would elicit these types of responses. It's just part of the nature of Scientology. And I did that training as a young kid. I was almost never in Scientology when I wasn't a child. So all these things took place when I was actually a child. I left when I was 21. All right, so the next thing I have on here is putting kids in dangerous situations. So when I was a kid, and I was about, I would say about 8, 9, 10, at the boarding school that I was at, where I did not live in a home with my parents. I was essentially like, every morning we had our cleaning stations, and we were given like large jugs of ammonia, bleach, alcohol, and we were just like, I would dip my hands in those chemicals. I would create a bucket where I would put ammonia and I would put water in it. And to be honest, I don't know how much I was putting in there, and I would reach my hand in with the sponge and clean things. I mean, I only found out later that you're not supposed to mix bleach and ammonia. And these kids, I mean, these chemicals, all of the kids had access to. We used them every day. We also were tasked with things like sorting asbestos when we were renovating a certain building at the boarding school that I worked at. We did construction, and so we had to sift through all of this asbestos, put it into a wheelbarrow, haul it down to a big hole in the ground, and so it could essentially be hidden. And we did that with our hands, with no masks, and it was 100% asbestos. And we were told things. I didn't know what asbestos was. And the adults would say things like, asbestos is just calcium. It's just calcium and magnesium. It's just minerals. But I didn't know why they were saying that. So I was just like, okay. Like I could tell that they were being defensive about something, but I didn't know why. But that's 100% a corroboratable true story. And it's crazy. Another example of putting us in dangerous situations is that one of my jobs at this boarding school when I was about 7, 8 was to monitor the health of other kids. And so I would go around every day and ask the kids if they had sicknesses, and I would hand out vitamins and minerals and like salves and things like that. But I was handing out things like vitamin A, which kids could easily overdose on dangerously. When kids would be put in isolation if they were sick, I was monitoring their temperatures, and there were no parents there that were checking on them. There was no adult that was looking at their temperatures and making sure that they were okay. It was just me. I was responsible for bringing them food and that sort of thing. So if a kid would get like a really deep cut or something like that, then they would be brought to the doctor. But the entire time when I was 6 until I want to say about 14 years old, I never saw a doctor. I never once was brought to the doctor. And actually that's not true. I was brought to the doctor on one occasion, and that was so that I could do the purification rundown as a 9-year-old. And basically, this is a Scientology, it's a Scientology, what do I call it? Procedure. It's a Scientology program where essentially you are doing it so that you can get rid of drugs and toxins in your body to prepare yourself for further Scientology counseling. And this program consists of being in a sauna at 160 degrees for 5 hours a day. It consists of taking literal handfuls of vitamins, of running for 30 minutes straight before you get in the sauna on a treadmill, and you have to swallow vegetable oil and this other thing I don't know, it's not a vitamin, it's just like a nutritional supplement called lecithin. Anyways, so that was the only reason I went to the doctors, because you're required to get a brief physical before you do that. I never went to the doctor for any of the times I had an extremely high temperature. My parents were not there when I had a high temperature or when I was sick. Anytime that I had tonsillitis, anything like that. So yeah, but I was required to go in the sauna for 5 hours a day with other grown adults and complete this purification rundown, which was for an absolute minimum of 4 weeks. And I remember trying to get out of doing it anymore because I would just have to lay on the floor as the heat because the heat rose, so it was a little bit colder on the floor. And I remember saying that, oh my God, I feel so much better. I feel great about this, so that I could, because in order to complete the program, you had to say that you had some kind of realization or that you felt better. And so I said that, and I was almost complete with it, but then I started getting bloody noses every day, probably as a result of being in the sauna for 5 hours a day. And then I got put back on it, or I had to get a correction on it, and then I got put back on it briefly, and then I eventually finished it. But it's just another example of a dangerous situation that a little kid is being put in. There are so many other things like this, but this was just a brief synopsis that I came up with that I wanted to do a little video about, so that if anybody wanted to show this to somebody who thinks of Scientology as just a religion with silly beliefs that celebrities are into, that they can show them that this can help to show that this is actually a dangerous and abusive cult that harms children and puts children in harm's way. I couldn't care less if people believe in aliens or whatever other story. It's just, that part's neither here nor there to me. It's the illegal and abusive things that they do. That's why it's important to me to spread the word about the true nature of Scientology. All right, you guys, I know this was a tough one today, but I hope you found it helpful. And if you have any questions about this whatsoever, please leave them in the comments. I will try to address them in another video. And this is number 1 on the worst things about Scientology, child abuse. So I will go into number 2, number 3, and so far I just have 5 on the list. But thank you so much for hanging out with me. Don't forget to check out Sins of Scientology on YouTube. It's a wealth of information about Scientology. And if you have not already read my book, you can find it on Amazon. It is called Beyond Belief, My Secret Life Inside Scientology and My Harrowing Escape. All right, see you guys soon. Bye.